Welcome everyone to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Peter Loewen. I'm the director of the school, and it's my great honor today to welcome you to this very important conversation on the future of Europe and democracy and the conflict that we're seeing in Europe today with a most distinguished guest. I'm going to allow him to be introduced in just a moment. Before I do that, I just want to first acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has for thousands of years been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we are lucky to live and to work and to play and to indeed gather on this land and to welcome you here today to this little part of Turtle Island. I'm going to let an introduction be made by my esteemed colleague, who I'll just point to now. Andres Kasekamp is the chair in Estonian Studies here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, a professor of history, I think an honorary professor of political science, and for my money, one of the keenest and most important observers of politics, not only in the Baltic states, but across Western, Eastern Europe, and beyond. So, Andreas, thank you very much for being here at the school and for bringing to us this remarkably distinguished guest who you now have the honor of introducing and speaking with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for that overly kind introduction. So it is indeed my great honor and privilege to welcome President Karis to University of Toronto. And as you all know, University of Toronto has is distinguished by having the only chair of Estonian Studies anywhere in North America, which is endowed thanks to the Estonian community here. I'm especially glad to welcome President Karis to the University of Toronto because I used to refer to him always as rector Alar Karis, or Professor Alar Karis. He is not a career politician, but a scholar, a longtime academic. He's raised and educated in Tartu. He's been a professor of molecular genetics and developmental biology. He's worked in universities in Germany, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands in the 1990s before he joined the University of Tartu as a professor in 1990, later went on to be the rector or president of the university. And when I was a professor there as well, he was my boss. So I'm particularly glad to see him here today. But he didn't go directly from the position of a university rector. And in the Estonian case, being the rector of University of Tartu is almost as important a job as being the president of Estonia. It's a very visible, influential position. But he had a few more very influential and interesting positions before coming to the presidency. He was the Auditor-General of the Republic of Estonia. And he was also director of the National Museum of Estonia, which is also a very high-profile position. And let me say, upon becoming president, Estonians have always been critical of the way their presidents are elected, the design of the electoral system. It goes through the parliament, and if it doesn't work in the parliament, there's this special electoral college. And this time, when President Karis was elected a year ago, before that happened, there were also rumblings of this, why are we using this system? But in this case, I believe this system has proved its worth because finally we got a president who enjoys greater support amongst all of the political parties and greater popular support amongst the population than any of his predecessors upon coming to office. And in the year and a half that he's been in office, I think he has certainly earned the trust and respect of not only Estonian citizens, but of his colleagues in Europe and the wider international community. Now, he'll be speaking about Ukraine, and Ukraine is vitally important for Estonia. Estonia feels itself to be a frontline state. And Estonia has supported Ukraine per capita more than anyone else. And it's particularly suitable that President Karis will be speaking on Ukraine today because he visited Kyiv, met with President Zelensky shortly before the war, and he was among the very first heads of state to return to Kyiv immediately after the invasion. So it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome President Karis, and we look forward to your remarks. So the podium is yours. And later we'll have a Q&A and discussion here.
Director, dear Andres, and thank you very much for his kind introduction. Dear friends, yes, I come from Estonia, a small country that came into existence on 24th of February 1918. This was a unique window of opportunity for a small nation, the result of the upheaval of the First World War and the 1917 revolution, which toppled the Russian Empire. In Western Europe, Estonia and our neighbors, Latvia and Lithuania, were called states for season, meaning that we were something that passes, a bit like summer that gives way to autumn. And they were right. The empire did strike back, and Estonia lost its brief period of independence when the Second World War broke out in 1939. And Moscow returned to reclaim what they felt was their rightful possession. For the next 50 years, Estonia was back in the belly of the beast, but now called itself the Soviet Union. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because the story continues. History is not over. We may have briefly believed that the world had changed and borders, at least in Europe, would not be changed by military force. But people could choose their own form of government and generally live in peace. However, as became clear on 24th February 2022, the empire next door had awakened and begun reclaiming its sphere of influence once more. This is the reason I am asking the question today: is Ukraine our moment of truth? Do we still subscribe to the view that the right of some nation to exist is a seasonal pastime that can be revoked when the empire of the world feel like it? More specifically, what is the price that we are willing to pay for lasting democracy and freedom? Not just for those fortunate enough to live among peaceful nations, but also for those which happen to border a country with a desire to turn back time using death and destruction. Let me be clear. Euro-Atlantic security architecture and our shared values face the most serious threat since the end of the Second World War. In Europe, that threat comes from Russia. And how we respond to it will have implications for the world we live in the decades to come. It is crucial to understand that Russia's strategic objective is broader than controlling Ukraine. It is nothing less than the destruction of Euro-Atlantic security architecture. This also includes the restoration of dominance over the Baltic states and Poland, as was evident in the demands made by President Putin in December 1921. Putin's strategy for a moment is to coerce us into giving up on Ukraine by imposing costs of our societies. His primary tool is to weaponize its energy resources by restricting their accessibility, thereby threatening shortages, and by damaging our economics through inflation. In its immediate neighborhood, Russia can also use hybrid warfare to scare and destabilize. This includes sabotaging energy infrastructure, using the migration weapon, and carrying out cyber attacks. We must be prepared to overcome these challenges and not allow those tactics to cover us. However, we also need to prepare for a potential military escalation and indeed significantly enhance our ability to deter and defend against Russia. Here we are luckily on the right track. After the 24th February, NATO has increased the readiness of its forces, strengthened its presence on the eastern flank, including in Estonia, and made plans at the Madrid summit to further enhance the alliance's deterrence and defense posture. Estonia itself has embarked on a considerable program to enhance our own national military capabilities and raising our defense spending beyond the 2% GDP required by NATO. In addition to this, we are also addressing other aspects of the Russian threat. For example, by finding alternative sources of energy supply, enhancing our security of our energy infrastructure, and by taking additional measures to secure our borders with Russia. We are also supporting Ukraine's fight for its independence by providing weapons and equipment, which by now amounts to a quarter of our yearly defense spending. If we translate it into Canadian terms, Canada would have to spend $9.3 billion to reach that same level. According to official statistics, so far Canada has committed around $1 billion in military assistance to Ukraine, which is, of course, a very big number and has been a very big help to Ukraine without doubt. We have ample proof that Ukraine is capable of putting the military support provided by Western allies to good use. So it is important we all try to do better. All these steps are increasing our security at this difficult time. Yet we need to look much further than the next couple of months, or even the next couple of years. The Euro-Atlantic community needs a long-term strategy to deal with the threats we face to our security from Russia, but also from other authoritarian competitors. What were the elements of such a strategy? First, the strategy should not take a fear of what happens when Russia is defeated as a starting point. Second, NATO must implement the decision to move to a modern forward defense posture in a timely manner. Third, we should not leave grey areas in Europe but to play the unfortunate role of buffer states. This will only lead to more instability. Ukraine achieving its stated goal of restoring its full territorial integrity will obviously mean a defeat for Russia. I know that there are some concerns that this would lead to an instability or even the disintegration of Russia. However, let me remind that the similar strategy of prioritizing the stability of Russian leadership over other consideration in the late 80s and 90s, and it did not lead to more security. It enabled the Russian leadership to consolidate its stranglehold over the emerging democracy and did nothing to restrain Moscow's imperialist ambitions in its neighborhood. So while instability in Russia may be a risk, the current form of stability where Russia attacks its neighbor, Ukraine, and attacks us with weapons of corruption, energy blackmail, information, and influence operation cannot be our goal. The most effective strategy towards Russia continues to be containment economically, politically, and militarily. In the military domain, this means that we need to strengthen NATO's forward defense so that we are able to defend every inch of Allied territory. Right now, NATO's ability to defend countries such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania depend heavily on bringing in reinforcement forces and military equipment from Germany, US, and other parts of the alliance. In addition to our own units, we only have a small tripwire force, which is not something you can wage a full-scale war with, like the one we are witnessing in Ukraine. However, Russia has a huge geographical advantage in the Baltic region, and it is able to attack without much advance warning. This means that for us to be able to defend the eastern flank, we need more forward-positioned NATO forces on the ground, as well as ammunition and equipment. We need to prepare and assign additional reinforcement forces that could be rapidly be brought to the Baltics. Canada has committed to assign a brigade to Latvia, which is highly commendable. Now it's important to turn its commitment into reality. After the Cold War ended, much of NATO military capabilities were dismantled, and now we need to work on restoring them. We are no longer fighting the Taliban, but a near-peer adversary. Let me assure you, Estonia is doing its part. In a few years, we will reach 3% of GDP for defense spending, something that only a few NATO allies do. Let me also emphasize that American and Canadian contributions to our shared security in the Euro-Atlantic space will remain critical. I believe that we in Europe should invest much more in defense and become more military capable. However, the value of the transatlantic bond goes beyond the numbers of troops and weapons systems. It is a political community, a community of values, and we have demonstrated already that we are much stronger together. We all know the connection that exists between the democracy and peace. Democracies guarantee individual freedom and the security of the citizens better than any other form of government, but also peaceful and mutually beneficial relationship among each other. It is with other democracies that we can develop commerce and trade without fearing that these ties will lead to dangerous dependencies. Dependencies that can be weaponized by political influence or to undermine and divide our societies. Therefore, it's our interest to contribute to this vicious circle of making the world safe for democracy and supporting democracy where you can to make the world safer. Democracies do not fight each other. Today, Ukraine and NATO eastern flank are the areas where Russian aggression or the threat of it puts democracy and peace particularly at risk, putting also European security at large at risk. This is not just important for Canada because of our community of values that needs to be protected. The EU is Canada's third largest trading partner, with a value of trade in goods and services around 100 billion Canadian dollars in 2021. The free trade agreement between Canada and European Union has led to impressive growth of mutual trade and important engine for the Canadian economy. The long-term stability and security of Europe is therefore also in Canada's economic interest. And an investment in European security through NATO is also an investment in mutually beneficial economic relations. As you know, Ukraine has asked to join NATO. As an Estonian, I can assure you that the only security guarantees with teeth come from NATO membership. So our open door policy cannot just be the rhetorical comfort blanket. We must seriously look into further enlargement if peace and security in Europe are worth it to us to provide those guarantees to European nations who wish to have them. We must give Ukraine's application serious consideration. It is important to realize that when we talk about abstract concepts, security, architecture, democracy, freedom, we are actually talking about very real consequences for real people. Violence, death, and destruction happen to people. In Estonia, we have experienced the same thing you see on your screens happening in Ukraine. In fact, many Estonians had to flee to Canada and other free countries in the 90s, 40s to avoid the same fate that befell the inhabitants of Bucha, Mariupol, Kherson. We will always remain grateful to Canada of accepting Estonian refugees, some of whom, in the desperation, crossed the Atlantic on self-made Viking boats. And we are grateful to Canada for doing its important part in NATO, the organization that safeguards our collective security and through that our shared values. I am confident that Canada will continue to be a force of good in the world. Among other things, Canadians have been an example to us, Estonians, as well as the rest of the world, regarding welcoming and helping people who are escaping the horror of war. Put quite simply, we need more Canada in the world. You are the future of this great country, and I want to encourage all of you to contribute to this end. In Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood tells the story of a repressive society called Gilead. Gilead is what Russia is like today. It is a totalitarian regime controlled by a small group of people. It is a place where telling the truth has become treason, where most people are left powerless and fearful. Instead of just gender-based repression, the Russian power vertical represses many groups in society. In particular, it crushes its ethnically indigenous people who are being killed off in the ongoing war at astonishing rates. This is what we must fight at home and in the world. We must all think that this is our business. I still remember what I meant to live in the Soviet Union, and many Estonians do. This is why we will not stop fighting for freedom and will not stop helping others who do not do the same. I hope that we are in this together. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, we have half an hour for discussion, comments. The way we do things here at the Munk School is that we hand out papers, and you can write your questions. Then they get sent up to me, and I kind of filter them. I put on my reading glasses, and I try to understand your handwriting, and then we'll try to group these questions together. But while I'm waiting for the questions to arrive up here, let me ask, you outlined all the great contributions that Estonia is making to support Ukraine. But Estonia, of course, is a very small country which is on the front line, is experiencing very high inflation, has its challenges with its energy security. How is it that Estonians are so committed to helping Ukraine, and how are they managing?
That's not an easy question, because when the war escalated in February, I was also surprised, but so many Estonians are so open-hearted and helping Ukrainians. So we have now in Estonia something like 60,000 refugees from Ukraine. For a small country like Estonia, there are 1.3 million people. 60,000 is quite a number. It makes up 4% of our population. So we're trying to shelter, give them shelter, education, and both. And as well, as you mentioned already, we have supported Ukraine quite a lot already from the very beginning, or even before the escalation, sending javelins, anti-tank missiles to Ukraine and so forth. And the civilians, ordinary people, have provided help to Ukraine around 21 million euros. And altogether, military help, as I mentioned, was 1/4 of our military budget. And it's 250-something billion euros. So we are trying to help. And to answer your question, why we are doing this, I mean, it's probably because of our past. We know what it means. We still have our mothers and fathers and grandfathers living who are still telling the story of what happened in 1939, later on also during 40s. And as I mentioned, quite a number of Estonians had to leave Estonia to Canada, including my relatives. So it's a story that's behind this help probably. And of course, we have to keep democracy prevail. So this is, I think, of utmost importance.
Okay, I see that there are some papers, but they're not in my hand yet. So I will ask another question that I mentioned in the introduction that you were in Kiev meeting with President Zelensky immediately prior to the invasion, and together with your Polish, Latvian, and Lithuanian colleagues, you were the first heads of state to return to Kiev to meet with Zelensky, and that provided sort of very important moral support. Could you sort of share some of your insights into what that was like, and well, not to reveal any of your conversations with Zelensky, but some of your impressions?
Yes, I have been as a president 2 times in Ukraine. And the first time was 2 days before the war started. It was 22nd of February. And the second time, together with my colleagues, was 2 months later. So but 2 different visits, actually. But to be honest, President Zelensky was more worried before than when he was worried when the war already was there. So because uncertainty was kind of, made him probably anxious. But yes, I've seen all these authorities, all these war crimes. I've seen ruins. I've seen what Russian tanks have been doing in suburbs in Kiev. So at the time, there were more than 12,000 mines hidden under the bodies, under the dolls of kids and so forth. So it's horrible. It made you speechless. But that's why it's important to write down all these war crimes. And we probably need a special tribunal to make these people who are responsible to end up in prison. So that's why it's important to collect all this information right now. And it went worse. If you see what's happening now, I mean, they don't care. They don't care about Ukrainians for obvious reasons, but they also don't care about their own people. So they're sending young boys in a front just to making them really sort of innocent victims, and there is no way back. So and the same happened during the Second World War, as you probably know. The victims of Soviet Union were way more casualties compared to fascist Germany. So only thing what we can do now is to do everything to give support to Ukraine to end this war as soon as possible. And what Estonia is also doing, we are helping already. We have picked up one region, the Žitomi region, and we started building now a kindergarten in this region. and trying to give any support, because building up the country takes, well, not centuries, but definitely more than 10, 20 years.
Okay, now I have quite a few questions, and many of them have to do with NATO. And so perhaps the first one, continuing with Ukraine, that several are asking about Ukraine's NATO perspective. That is this really feasible? Is it realistic?
Of course, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen when the war is going on, and it doesn't happen next day after the war is over. But it definitely will happen at some point, and we have to, because Estonia is advocate of a open door policy. The same applies to European Union. So we also ask for this membership starting right now, and this actually happens. Concerning NATO, I was also in Finland and in Sweden in November. And I met politicians, and I talked to the king, I talked to the president of Finland, and they were actually more scared than Estonians about what's going to happen with this escalation. And I told them, why don't you, if you're so scared, why don't you join NATO? And what they said, no, we are neutral. We are a neutral country, we will never join NATO. And according to poll, the public poll was 23% supported being a NATO member. 4 or 5 months later, we are now talking about, becoming a member of the alliance, and we are just waiting behind to one country to accept this as well. So things happen very fast, and probably the same might happen also with Ukraine membership. But of course, they have to be ready. Because what we don't need, as I mentioned, these grey zones, and we don't need frozen conflicts in Europe. There are already quite a number of them.
You just touched on this, and this is one of the questions that I have here about Sweden and Finland's NATO membership, which, as you just mentioned, they have applied, but it's now still being held up by 2 member states, Hungary and Turkey. And so how hopeful are you, the question asked, how hopeful you are for a NATO Christmas present? Maybe from Hungary,
well,
perhaps not Turkey.
Yeah, it's the question to President Erdogan.
Yeah.
So he has to make this Christmas gift present. But I'm quite sure he will sign at some point. Maybe not by Christmas, but hopefully by Christmas. Because President of Hungary already said, okay, I will accept this. But you have to also understand that there are the elections of a president in 2023. So it's also part of this kind of bargain probably. So we'll see. But I mean, every country or every head of state who meets Erdogan picks up the topic. So and also Jens Stoltenberg and some others. I haven't had a chance to meet Erdogan. I have several attempts, but hopefully I'll meet him as well, and I tell the same thing, that he should give his signature.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question: how should NATO respond to the threat of nuclear escalation from Russia?
It's a question whether there's going to be any nuclear escalation, but of course it's another threat from Putin's side that he could push a button, but it doesn't give the end to the war. So it doesn't help much Putin, and he probably realizes himself, if he does realize what's actually going on. Because, the war has been escalating quite recently, and might be that there is also an idea to push a button. But as far as response is concerned, it's not going to be a nuclear response for sure. But there are some ideas how to deal with this situation.
Mm-hmm. And this leads to another question. How high do you think the probability is that Russia will attack another European country if not defeated in Ukraine?
If Russia is going to attack another European country or NATO country, it's going to attack NATO. including Canada. So it's not a question of Estonia, Latvia, or Poland, or any other country in Europe. It's NATO ally country, and there is definitely going to be a response.
And how do we picture victory in Ukraine? There's so many questions here, that kind of rapid fire questions. That what does a Ukrainian victory look like? And will, a separate question, would Putin be willing to accept defeat in Ukraine?
It really doesn't matter whether Putin accepts this defeat or not. It's his problem. But how to celebrate the victory? It's not that easy question, because if you have lost so many lives, I mean, women, children, you are not going to celebrate it. You are going to build up your country again, and of course, establish the borders which have been there before the first escalation.
But the question also contained, what does this victory look like for Ukraine? Does it involve then regaining all of its territory prior to 2014?
This is what Zelensky says. It's up to Ukrainian people and up to Ukrainian president. So it's the same question whether Ukraine should sit down and start discussing with Russia. It's not up to us. It's up to Ukraine.
Okay, now some questions about Estonia. That we've heard how Estonians are very supportive of Ukraine, but there are some people in Estonia who might have other views, who might support the other side in the conflict. And the question is precisely about what portion of the population in Estonia might follow the Russian line, and another question related to that, Russian disinformation in Estonian society, and what groups are targeted and what measures is Estonia taking to counter this?
I mean, luckily in Estonia, you can have different views. But of course, the percentage now of these people who are pro-Putin, there was a survey, and it's about 20% of this Russian minority. So it's not that many, but they are still there, and mostly elder generation. That means older people, and there are already a number of situations where parents don't talk to the kids anymore. So they basically even abandoned the kids because they are pro-Ukraine, helping Ukraine, not only in Estonia but also in Russia. So they are divided. And what we did about the disinformation is we closed these propaganda TV channels, because most of the Russians, or quite a number of Russians, live in northern eastern part of Estonia, which is close to Russia. And but nevertheless, I mean, if you close down the modern TV broadcasting, you can still have an old-fashioned antenna and pick up this propaganda from Russian side. But there are still not so many people. And secondly, what we did, we allocated certain amount of money to Russian television in Estonia. It means Russian for Russian-speaking minority, and also private channels. So we doubled basically the resources to these channels that they get the right information, what is correct and based on facts.
Here are two questions on democracy. And one is how to convince people that democracy is indeed a universal value rather than just a Western value. And a related question, that beyond sanctions and military support, how can Canada and Estonia and other democracies protect and enhance liberal democracies globally?
For me, it's a question of education. That means you have to start already on very early stage, when you are not in a kindergarten maybe, but definitely at school. So we have to educate and to give examples why we think it's a right path. And I'm quite sure that democracy will prevail. There are always ups and downs. And we have seen already in quite recent years, and also in Estonia, general election coming in March, so there are already quite a number of different opinions up there. So, but in general, I'm quite convinced. What's the other option?
Well, there might be other options. Here's a question from an MGA student. How is Estonia looking to make diplomatic ties outside of Europe, specifically in Asia, with Asian partners, and what would be their significance? Obviously, Estonia is more focused on Europe, but...
I mean, we have ties with many countries. And of course, now the question is always about China. What is going to happen with China? Our ties are not that tight, because the trade is not that big. It's about 1% or even less. And we also, there was a kind of format, 16+1 or 17+1. That means different, mostly Eastern European countries and China sitting behind the table and discussing things and our future. So we pulled ourselves out of this format. And because what we want to have is China versus European Union, or China, or bilateral connections. But yeah, there are, apart China, there are a number of other countries. Of course, Estonia is small. We can't be everywhere. And our trade is mostly in Europe, Finland, Sweden, Germany, and others. But we try to be also present in Africa.
I forgot to mention when introducing you, in your very long biography, you were also the honorary consul of Chile in Estonia. So
that's correct.
So you're the South American connection as well.
Yeah, I had to give up this position because I can't, you know.
This is, I guess, a question that also concerns Canadians as much as Estonians. Looking south of the border here, I mean, obviously it's a hypothetical question that's difficult to speculate on, but if the sort of previous administration returns, that puts NATO in a pickle, in a difficult position. And the question basically is, how can sort of European countries ensure their own security if support from the US for political reasons lessens or even disappears?
When history never comes back the same way. I mean, it's always different. But of course, presence of US is important as a NATO member because more than 70, I don't know, 80% money comes from US. But we don't need kind of European type of NATO, so in parallel. So anything what we do in Europe to support NATO is good. And as I mentioned, our percentage of GDP to defense is more than 2%. So if other countries also do the same, so we're on the safe side. So I don't think this, of course, this topic comes up again, I'm sure. But definitely not as, because you see, there was the Ukrainian war. In past, it wasn't there, at least in such a way. So things are different.
And speaking of Ukraine and NATO, again, a question about your recommendations for Ukraine before joining NATO. What should Ukraine be doing to make its case and strengthen its case as a future member of NATO?
It's very simple. It's just copy Estonia, what we did. Join EU first, and then it's easier to join NATO.
Okay, since you mentioned the EU, how easy it is about joining the European Union. I remember very clearly the idea of Ukraine becoming even a candidate for membership in the EU really wasn't on the table before the war. And that sort of in the summer, that changed in the summer.
Exactly.
That's a milestone, but then getting to the next point of actual membership, that, as we know from the Estonian case, that took 8 years.
While, yeah.
That took 8 years, and it involved transforming society completely. So you're very correct, I think, that EU opens the door for NATO. But so maybe comment a little bit about Ukraine's EU prospects.
When I was in Ukraine, in Kiev, I also talked about this EU candidacy, and what they told at the time, that they have something like 62 or 67 even % the requirements are fulfilled already. But the European Union is not only requirements, it's also that the rest of European Union member countries, they feel that this country belongs to the European Union. So it's not only numbers and requirements. And we see already, I mean, there are a number of countries which are waiting there already, starting with Turkey, and then some other Western Balkan countries. So it's a process, and I guess we are able to help Ukraine in this path. And because what they do need, or what they did need, was light at the end of the tunnel. This was important to also concerning the war in Ukraine. So they need something to fight for.
Let me ask you about another country that's close to the heart of Estonians, and a country too where our students here from the Center for European Russian Eurasian Studies at the Munk School often go on excursions, Georgia. Georgia is exactly the same in the sense that you just mentioned, that it's fulfilled many, if not most, of the requirements for membership. But yet, somehow, the door is open, but they're not really close to crossing the threshold. Perhaps a few comments about, I'm sure you know the Georgian case well.
It's difficult to comment. Of course, Georgia is different. Even now, how they behave during, they support, of course, Ukraine. But at the same time, they also have quite a number of Russians coming over to Ukraine and stay there. So they are more influenced by Russia than any other countries we mentioned. So what Estonia did, we closed the border for tourists. That means Russian tourists, they can't come over to Estonia. The same did Finland a bit later, of course. They are a bit slower than Estonians in many cases. So, but we can't afford that at the same time when Ukrainians are fighting and dying for his country, Russians are just having fun in Spain and some other places. So that's why we closed the borders, and of course they come if they have relatives or something, but for tourists, yes. But yeah, Georgia is different, and there are so many issues to solve within Georgia. Then they really start working on EU membership.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of Russian asylum seekers to and draft dodgers to Estonia, because the Baltic states got a lot of negative publicity around that. But I think by now most people have understood and accepted why that was a very necessary step. There's a question about sanctions and their effectiveness and their effect, and also the potential for strengthening them. And Estonia has always been at the forefront in this. And of course, we should also mention that Estonia did enjoy an economic relationship with Russia, which was disrupted already long before this, already in 2014. So what's the Estonian perspective on strengthening sanctions, and what about their effectiveness?
I think the effect is there. Mm-hmm. Of course, for some sanctions it takes time. For some sanctions it takes less time. But you see already an effect. And of course, in European Union, some countries have more ties and dependent on let's say Russian gas and oil, and they have more difficult maybe. But in Estonia, we are not that dependent on Russian oil and gas. The gas is about 5%. Coming from Russia, and by the end of this year, using Russian gas is actually banned. So we can substitute with LNG, we can substitute with biomass, we can substitute with solar energy, and wind power as well. So we are trying to diversify, and of course, as a immediate, how to get rid of Russian dependency in gas is we have oil shale, which is not an environmentally friendly way of producing electricity, but in short run it does work. So we can substitute gas with oil shale oil easily. So, and by 2030, Estonian energy is should be all depend on renewables.
In your conversations with Canadian policymakers, I mean, Olaf Scholz was here in the summer, and Canada produces a lot of energy, but it's not exporting really anything to Europe. Did that come up? As Canada,
No,
as a friendly democratic country who could be a reliable supplier?
Well, it didn't come up, but it did come up the question because what we are discussing in Estonia is a nuclear plant, and in Canada you have this modular way of making these nuclear plants, and Estonian people are coming over to have a look. And we only started discussion in Estonia having a nuclear plant or not, but at this very moment it's only the most safest way of producing energy. So, and the technology develops and they are getting more and more safer. Even Japan accepts already that yes, we can go on with nuclear plants. So yes, but we didn't discuss about sending anything to Europe.
And speaking of Canadian and Estonian relations, in your discussions, and I know you had an exceptional meeting last night. I saw your Facebook post of your meeting with the Foreign Affairs and Defence Affairs Committees in Parliament in Ottawa. How do you see Canada's role expanding in Europe in general, but specifically in the Baltic region? Because we all know that Canada is the lead country in the NATO mission and has forward presence in Latvia. And Canadian attention has been mostly focused on Latvia, but is some of that attention rubbing off on Estonia as well?
As I said, more presence in the eastern flank is good for NATO. And of course, we are now discussing after Madrid summit about UK having a brigade allocated to Estonia. So discussions are going there. Our government's already signed some papers. So we are going to rely mostly on UK because we have 2 brigades, so we need a division. And what we don't need another brigade in Estonia on our soil, but it has to be allocated there. When we want it, they come. That means we also have to do something about that. That means we have to have ammunition, we have to have space there to put all these troops and so forth. So it's not only that we're waiting troops for UK and ourselves doing anything. Nothing.
Following up with Canada and the UK, it's hopefully most of you have heard the news that Canada will be opening an embassy finally in
Oh, right, yes,
in Estonia.
I forgot almost, yes.
That it's,
yeah.
because Canada's only had an embassy in Riga, which has, it has a little branch office in Tallinn and Vilnius, but now we'll have a real Canadian ambassador in Tallinn. That decision was made in the summer, and that's going to happen next year, so that's great news. But let me ask you about this reliance on the UK, which you just mentioned, because Brexit, of course, has, I think, shown that the UK is perhaps not as reliable and can't meet all of its commitments as it previously seemed to be able to. Fortunately, it's been, the new Prime Minister was just in Kyiv, and its commitment to Ukraine is still strong. But there was that issue with the troops that they brought into Estonia at the beginning of the war, and now they've returned back home.
But this was supposed to be temporary anyway.
Yeah.
So it's headlines what you read, but
Right.
it's supposed to be temporary. So it's nothing happened in between. But well, EU is one thing, but NATO is another thing. And now after Brexit, UK is more involved in NATO. That means being present in Europe via NATO. So we rely on UK and yeah.
No, well, that was I remember that very clearly as well. When Brexit happened, that they would say, "Don't worry, we will be now strong in NATO." And they, even with their best intentions, of course, with their financial circumstances being much more constrained than previously, then their good intentions just might not be able to be fulfilled in all cases.
Yeah, that's why you have to keep eye on
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
keep contact. So that means that's important.
Right, they need to be reminded of their commitments then. Okay, we're coming to the end of our time. And I think I've gone through most of the questions, having grouped them, being them mostly about NATO and Ukraine. So the President has also very graciously agreed to stick around for a little while, perhaps take a photograph with Estonian students, the ones who are here present, maybe with some Estonian pensioners as well. So let me once again say what a wonderful privilege it was to host you here, and I'm so glad that you took the time out of your schedule to come here. I know the main reason that you came to Canada was the Halifax International Security Forum, where you were on the opening panel with the Defense Minister of Canada, and you've had impactful meetings in Ottawa. And you're flying home tonight, and you still have some events scheduled today.
Yeah, talking to the Prime Minister. It's,
Yeah,
it's one event.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's come to Toronto to meet with you. Right. So, big round of applause. And
Thank you.